Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Rose Among Nations, our event focusing on Persian Jewish poetry with our teacher, Alan Niku, who is a Persian Jew who's interested in and reads a lot of old Persian manuscripts. He is also a filmmaker and a contributor to the Jewish Language Project with a focus on the Neo-Aramaic of the Jews of Western Iran. Alan, are you ready? Very
Yes,
excited.
I am. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Sorry for my lighting. It's just kind of dark outside. So good morning if you're where I am on the West Coast, or good afternoon on the East Coast. As Mira said, I am not really a scholar. I'm kind of I'm a Persian Jew who was interested in the subject of like what was the literature of my people, of the Persian Jews. And so I started reading. There aren't really many books published about this, but I started reading, I started studying, I started looking into old manuscripts in libraries, and found this huge world opening up before me of really interesting Persian Jewish literature that that we don't really hear about very much. So hopefully this will be a nice introduction to the subject for a lot of you. And despite that, we're also going to go very deep into this very, very niche subject. So I hope you'll enjoy that. Let me pull up my screen and share that with you in a second. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is going to be floral imagery in Persian Jewish poetry. That's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm very happy to be sharing with you today. So the first question you might ask, this seems like a very, very specific idea, floral imagery in Persian Jewish poetry. Most people have probably never even heard of Persian Jewish poetry, so why are we immediately jumping into something so specific as floral imagery? So why are we talking about flowers? The upcoming holiday of Shavuot, that's in 2 days. The upcoming holiday of Shavuot in the Persian culture and Persian Jewish culture is called Moed E Gol. The word for the holiday is Moed E Gol. People didn't really use Shavuot back in the day. They would call it Moed E Gol. So Moed means holiday. That's a Hebrew word, holiday or festival. Is like a connective word, kind of means of. And Gol is the Persian word for flower, more specifically for roses. You're going to hear the word Gol a lot in the poems that we're going to look at a little bit later. First, we're going to do an intro, then we're going to look at some examples. You're going to see the word Gol a lot, so just keep in mind the word Gol. And then this same idea, this Moed blank, is a common way to name holidays among Persian Jews. So Sukkot was traditionally called Moed Sukkah, holiday of the Sukkah. Passover was called Moed Nisan, holiday that is in the month of Nisan. Where does this come from? Possible origins, one is the very obvious, the very kind of intuitive one. Shavuot takes place in the springtime, so flowers are blooming. There are super blooms, this is when the flowers are out and about. So this holiday was celebrated with a lot of flowers. People would set out flowers in the house during Shavuot, springtime, all of that. Other possible explanations of the term Moed E Gol, where that came from. There is something called semantic matching, which is when a word from one language is changed to a similar sounding word from another language. So Moed E Gadol, that's very Hebrew. Moed E Gadol would mean the great holiday. And this Hebrew word Gadol, meaning great, may have been replaced by a similar sounding Persian word, Gol. So initially it might have been the great holiday, and that became the flower holiday or the rose holiday. Another possibility, this is actually my theory, is that it's from Moed E Gol. Goel is from the Hebrew word Geula, Geula meaning redemption. And Goel means, it's the active form of that, it means the Redeemer. So the Redeemer, it's Shavuot's the holiday where we receive the Torah. So that in some ways is seen as the redemption or the end of the redemption of the Jews, like the beginning of this new way of life after leaving slavery in Egypt and being redeemed by receiving the Torah. However, in the book of Ruth, which we read on Shavuot, Boaz is referred to as Goel, as Ruth's redeemer, because he is the one who accepts her into the Jewish community. So I think that may be where this term comes from, Moed E Gol, and Goel very easily could have been, sounded like Gol, and so it became Holiday of the Flowers. Either way, even if it was an accident that it became Holiday of the Flowers, it's still today celebrated with flowers. Flowers are a big part of the holiday of Shavuot, and they're a big part of the Persian and Persian Jewish community in general. And so we're going to go into what this rose stands for and means in Persian poetry. So first of all, much of what we know about Persian Jews, especially historically, can be gleaned from reading firsthand sources. These sources are these manuscripts that I mentioned. They go back 1,000 years up to the modern day. And a great majority of them are poems written by the Persian Jews. There are a lot of other things the Persian Jews also wrote, halachic treatises. They wrote all kinds of, they wrote all kinds of stuff. But even when they were writing about Jewish law and writing historical chronicles and things like that, they would often write them in poetic form. This is a very Persian thing to do. Persians love poetry. And so even if you read a poetic chronicle, you might see it as a poem. In my opinion, the Persian Jewish poetry that is out there and is relatively unknown should be considered a part of the greater Persian literary canon and also of the greater Jewish literary canon. So what is Persian poetry? Where is it from? On this map, you can see in the blue, that is kind of historically where most Persian poetry has come from. So there's Iran, Mesopotamia, Turkey, the Caucasus Mountains, Central Asia, and South Asia. So that region is where a majority of Persian poetry has been written. It's also been found in other places. It's been found in the Cairo Geniza in Egypt. It's been found as far east as China. So it is even bigger than this, but this blue area is the core. And Persian literature is one of the world's oldest literatures, and it's described as one of the great literatures of humanity. Goethe, the famous German author, mentions it being one of the 4 main bodies of world literature. And famous poets from this literature, these are non-Jewish poets, are Ferdowsi, Saadi, Hafez, Attar, Nizami, Rumi, and Omar Khayyam. These are some of the very famous ones. There are a lot more, of course, but those are the famous ones. In the 1200s, there was the ascendancy of ghazal, which is a poetic form, into a major verse form, as well as the rise of mystical and Sufi poetry that's known for its emotional and romantic lyrical qualities. If you read translations of Persian poetry, you'll find them incredibly romantic, very intense. We often joke among Persians that, like, if you try to say something romantic in English, it's not really going to do much. But if you say it in Persian, it'll definitely work. And there's a very mystical and Sufi quality. Sufism is nowadays known as Islamic mysticism, but back in the day, it was also known among the Jews. It was a Jewish mysticism as well. And we're going to see a lot of examples of that. Most examples of Persian Jewish poetry, which is also in this blue area, take place after the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion destroyed a lot of earlier sources. That was in the 1200s. The Mongols kind of decimated this entire blue region. But before that, there were also Jewish writings in this region. So many books of the Tanakh, the entirety of the Babylonian Talmud, works of the Geonim and the early Karaites were all written in Persia. They were written mainly in the Aramaic language, which was a language spoken throughout the Middle East. And in the 800s, 900s, we start to see New Persian as the language that people would write in. And a really interesting fact is that the earliest written evidence of the New Persian language is actually written in Hebrew letters. So you see how tied to Persian culture the Jews were even from 1100, 1200 years ago. Here's a quote from Vera Maureen about Persian Jewish poetry. On the left, that's an example of an illuminated manuscript, a manuscript that has Judeo-Persian written at the bottom and an illustration. So Vera Morin says that Judeo-Persian literature is the product of the confluence of two mighty literary and religious streams, the Jewish biblical and post-biblical heritage, and the Persian Muslim literary legacy. The influence of the monumental Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, the national epic of Persia, is pervasive, not just among his Muslim literary successors in Persian, but also among Judeo-Persian epic poets. Now we're going to look at some of who those epic poets were. So the first notable Persian Jewish poet that we see is Shahin Shirazi. Shahin lived in the 1300s, around 1290 to sometime after 1358. He was a contemporary of Hafez. He was a little bit older than Hafez, actually. And what he did, he took the stories of the Tanakh, so the books of the Torah, and he also did Job and the book of Esther, and he made them into these Persian epic poems. So they're written in epic poetic verse. However, they're stories of the Torah and the Tanakh. And he has a very Sufi flavor to it. It's a very mystical flavor. There's a lot of stuff about losing your ego, becoming one with God, becoming one with the universe, a lot of stuff like that. And it's massive. He wrote a lot of material. So just as an example, here's a book that I have. It's in Persian, but you can see how thick that is, and that's not the complete works of Shahin. It's just a selected part of the Torah section of his works. So very, very prolific writer. Then in the 14 and 1500s, we get Amrani. Amrani lived a very long time. He died in his 80s. And he continued the work that Shahin began. He infused a lot more kind of traditional Jewish qualities into it. So it's still epic poetic verse. He did more of the Tanakh, but he also did the same thing with the Mishnah. So there's a huge book he wrote that is the book of Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, which is a Mishnaic tractate that he wrote in epic poetic verse, which is pretty cool. Very unusual thing to read. Then we get to Aminah, who we're going to read some of his poems later. He was 1700s. He was a wide-ranging lyrical poet who wrote both in Persian and Hebrew. Between these three, we cover the cities of Shiraz, Esfahan, Kashan, and Hamadan. So very famous Persian Jewish cities. And then in the 16 to 1900s, there are many, many, many little known, but I think very valuable poets who you start to see, if you look at a bunch of manuscripts, you start to see repeating names, and you realize that these are like poetic traditions that existed and have kind of been lost since. So we're also going to look at some of these lesser known poets. We're going to look at a few examples. So what is the significance of the rose? Why the rose? Flowers, and roses in particular, are very important in Persian culture in general. It's one of the main flavors of Persian cuisine. If you've ever had any Persian desserts or Persian ice cream or even some of the stews, there's rose water in them. It's a very particular flavor. And it's very ubiquitous in Persian poetry as well. So individually, both the rose, which is called Gol, and the nightingale, which is called Bulbul, that's a kind of bird. So Gola Bulbul is a famous motif in Persian poetry. They're important motifs, both of them, Gola Bulbul. Alone, the rose served as a literary metaphor for perfection and beauty, and typically describes the beloved, either worldly or spiritual. The sweet-singing nightingale might represent the lover or the poet. So we have the beloved and the lover. And you see a lot of this kind of back and forth between the beloved and the lover, the agent and the object of love. Together, rose and nightingale are the types of beloved and lover. The rose is beautiful, proud, and often cruel. Roses do, after all, have thorns, while the nightingale sings endlessly of his longing and devotion. In praise texts, the poet Nightingale sang the praises of the beloved rose. In mystical poetry, the nightingale's yearning for the rose served as a metaphor for the soul's yearning for union with God. So we can see there is a kind of more literal version that you read in the poems, which is the lover who is yearning for the beloved, who is maybe distant or who he can't reach or he's been rejected by. And there's the more mystical side of it, where It is an adherent or a soul that's yearning for connection with God, which may be a difficult thing to come to, right? In any mysticism, the idea of becoming one with the universe, becoming one with God is kind of an unattainable goal. And yet that's what the Sufi or the mystic or the Buddhist or whatever tradition it is yearning for. And so there's that more mystical version of the rose and the nightingale. So here's an example from non-Jewish Persian poetry. This is from Hafez. He says, "My friends, better to tend to pleasure while the rose blooms. It's the world of the lover and will drink with pleasure. No generosity in anyone and the time for gaiety passing. The remedy is selling our prayer rug for wine." What is the rose in this? So while the rose blooms, it's not a literal, like, let's tend to pleasure while the rose is blooming. The rose stands for something. The rose stands for this idea of perfection, this idea of spiritual, mystical experience. And the key line in this is the last one. He says, "The remedy is selling our prayer rug for wine." It's an unusual line to come from a Muslim writer, a religious Muslim writer, wine being banned in Islam. So why is he saying this? Wine is actually it's also a symbol in Sufi poetry, and wine stands for kind of the direct experience of God, this direct experience of religion. And so what he's saying is that what's more important than the prayer rug being kind of the idea of going through the motions of religion, what's more important than going through the motions is the direct experience, right? And there's no doubt that Hafez also went through the motions and was lived a life as a religious person. But what he's saying is that the rose is blooming, this perfection is out there. And so we better go and enjoy this. We better go and, take part in the pleasure of that, of that direct experience. In fact, the direct experience of God is where we get pleasure from, not going through the motions of religion. This idea actually, it may sound familiar to you since this is my Jewish learning. I can bring up like the Hasidic movement, which came around in Eastern Europe and had this idea of, the direct experience of God, that mystical stuff is more important than the going through the motions of religion. And what people don't really talk about very much is that there's a direct line from Persian Sufi culture, which was both Islamic and Jewish, that made its way via the Persians into Turkey. Like Rumi, for example, the famous poet Rumi, moved to Turkey eventually. And from there, the Ottoman Empire took over Crimea and southern Ukraine, today's Ukraine, and spread a lot of these Sufi ideas into that region. And then you get, right after that, itinerant preachers like the Baal Shem Tov spreading these mystical ideas throughout Eastern Europe in the form of Hasidism. So there is a direct line between Persian Sufi poetry and Hasidic culture, which I think is very cool, especially because we're about to look at some Persian Jewish poetry. So in Persian Jewish poetry, the rose is not handled any differently than in Muslim poetry, even though the religious concepts and sources may differ. Floral imagery is everywhere in Persian poetry. Like at first, when I was told that I should speak about the rose in Persian Jewish poetry, I was like, that's really specific. That might be really hard to find references to. Turns out it was quite easy. Basically, any poem in any manuscript I opened up to had some kind of reference to flowers, rose, some kind of floral imagery. It's very, very common. The rose, the object of love in these poems, once again, functions as a metaphor for earthly pleasures, spiritual and mystical yearning, physical beauty, and so on. So we're going to look at some of these texts. Let's look at where the rose and the flower and that kind of imagery comes up, and the nightingale, of course, also. And we'll see what we can find. So the first one we're going to look at, this is from Babai ben Lotf. He was a historian who lived in Kashan, and he actually wrote a historical chronicle in 1662 about the forced conversions of the Jews of Persia. And even though it was a historical chronicle, he is Persian, and so he wrote it as a rhyming, versified epic poem. So the first one, this is just the kind of a basic example. It says, "The king went to the garden like a nightingale to smell the roses, the curly hyacinth." There's no reason that the author would mention the nightingale and the rose, right? The Gol E Gol in this, right? If it was just a historical chronicle, he would say the king went to the garden and he slept there that night. But he makes sure to include this imagery of the nightingale and the roses. He's saying the king, even the king is like the nightingale, is trying to attain this spiritual or earthly pleasure. The roses are there. The king is still, just like us, the king is yearning. And then the pleasures of the world, the roses, they make him forget about his dagger. And then later that's important because the dagger is used as a pretext to force convert the Jews. The dagger is stolen and the Jews are blamed and so on. Common story throughout many Jewish cultures. Another example from the same author, we're going to look at a few of his. He says, another day, Said the Jew, this one speaks to me because my dad's name is Said and he's a Jew. Another day, Said the Jew came to the vizier. He greeted that moon of the east. The vizier said, welcome, O visible light. Have you dreamed of Ali tonight? Ali is the kind of figurehead of Shia Islam. So what he's saying is, when he says, have you dreamed of Ali tonight? He means, have you decided to convert? He's trying to convince Said to convert. He says, say shahadat, which is it's the declaration that converts you to Islam. He says, say shahadat so you can see its honey. You get some wordplay, shah, the word for honey, sounds like shahadat, and pluck 100 roses from this earthly garden. So what he's saying when he says pluck 100 roses, again, that's not literal. He's saying you can get what you've always yearned for, right? If you say shahadat, if you convert to Islam, you can get everything you've always wanted. You've been a poor Jew your whole life. You've been struggling. All you have to do is convert and you'll pluck 100 roses from this earthly garden. You'll get all of what you want. Anything you want is possible. Clothes and robes and gold coins of every kind. It also, we get some earthly and spiritual beauty here, and some physical beauty. So in the first example here, it says in the middle, take them all to Nightingale Garden, Moed E Gol. Really interesting that it would be called Nightingale Garden. And because it's called Nightingale Garden, Baba Ibn Lutf makes sure to include rose imagery in the next line. He says that this garden is a terrible place. It's kind of where the Jews were driven out to. He says it was a garden empty of all trees. The roses of its garden were the ghouls of the desert. So this horrible place that they were forced to go to, the roses of its garden, the things that they might yearn for, all they could get was these terrifying creatures of the desert. There was no running water near it. The wolf was its only gardener. The wolf was its only gardener. Obviously, the wolf is not its gardener. It's saying, like, this is a dangerous place. This is the only thing you can hope for in a place like this is danger and death at the hands of the wild animals and the beasts. Another example, he says, so he's actually talking about his heroes here. He says, may I say lovely things to my literary heroes? May I smell the roses of Shahin and Emrani? So, may I smell their roses? That can mean two things. That can mean one, that he literally physically wants to go to their graves and smell the roses that are growing out of the graves of his heroes. That's a common thing in Persian poetry, talking about the dirt that somebody is buried under and how their body is feeding that dirt and how a flower might grow on that dirt and represent that person. But what he's also saying is, when he says, may I smell the roses, it means may I partake of the pleasure of Shahin and Emrani. May I attain that perfection of their works. He's hoping that he can be as great a poet as they are. There's another example when the king kidnaps a Jewish boy to take him into his harem, basically as a slave and a lover. It says he ordered them to take the boy to the baths to wash him with rose water, that flower-bodied one. So washing him with rose water, that's like, again, roses, the smell of roses is just considered to be pleasant. But he's also described as having a body like a flower. Physical beauty is described as with floral imagery. And one last example, this one I like because it kind of incorporates some Hebrew into it. It says, may its rose, it being God, may God's rose be fragrant until the day of resurrection. May whoever eats of it be well. So may you enjoy the pleasures of God. May you be one with God forever. May whoever sits at the foot of God's Narcissus never again see the face of captivity. Come hear about this redemption, which God created for the chosen people. And redemption, the word for redemption is ge'ulah. And it's not an accident that he uses ge'ulah right after talking about flower imagery. Ge'ulah, redemption, the one who is redeeming, God, is Goel. And Goel, as we mentioned, Goel means the redeemer, Gol means rose. So I think Baba Ibn Lotfir, back in 1662, is even making a connection between the idea of redemption, God, flowers, attaining that oneness with God and that connection. So that's a really cool one. Now, the next example we're going to look at, this is from Amina. He's the great lyrical poet from the 16 and 1700s. And this is from this is actually from a book. This is maybe the only book that's been written, published about Persian Jewish poetry. And I highly recommend it. It's called In Queen Esther's Garden by Vera Maureen. She translated a bunch of writings of the Persian Jews into English. So that's just a very good, if you enjoy this poem or any of these other poems, I would highly recommend getting Vera Maureen's book. So this is kind of an interesting translation. She makes it rhyme in English, which kind of changes the meaning from the Persian a little bit. But so we're not going to read the whole thing, but we can we'll look at it a little bit. So we can see that there's a lot of rose imagery. And of course, when he says, I wish to walk in the rose garden, it's both literal, just going for a nice walk, but also it means he wishes to attain what he's been yearning for. And there's this repeated line, I will be you and you will be me. Or in the original Persian, it's I will be the companion or the lover, and the lover will be me. So it's talking about the coming together of the lover and the beloved, two souls becoming one. This is a very common thing in any Jewish wedding. The rabbi will inevitably talk about two souls becoming one. And that's a very mystical idea that is present throughout this poetry. He says, I will be you, you will be me, we will become one with each other. Both two lovers becoming one with each other and the person and God becoming one. The mystical idea that I am not separate from the universe. I am part of the universe. I am one with the universe. So the rose is again used as a metaphor for yearning to become one. So we can see this. So I wish to walk in the rose garden. I will be you and you will be me, right? Walking in the rose garden with your lover, becoming one, but also attaining mystical oneness. We can see there's roses will pluck, our hearts carefree. I will be you and you will be me. Then there's literal lover imagery. I'll plant a kiss under your chin and four on the corners of your lips. So it is very romantic. We'll tumble in each other's arms. But then it also says, sitting together in the rose garden, without my leave, you'll smell no rose, things like that. And he even refers to his beloved as my lovely idol. So he's saying that like his beloved is something worthy of worship. Because again, it's this coming together of the literal lover imagery and the mystical God lover imagery. He has a lot of really interesting poetry. It's really cool to read. And it's really interesting because you actually learn a little bit of biographical information from reading his poetry. He was unhappily married and had 7 kids. And he actually writes a lot of poems about his problems with his wife and how he dislikes his wife, and they eventually divorced and he moved to another city and has it's very interesting. It's very cool to get that kind of biographical information about this obscure poet that we only know about from manuscripts. But despite that, he still has this like deeply romantic and mystical poetry. These are some other poems that I found that have rose imagery in them. These are kind of, I don't think they're as high quality as Amina's, but what they do is show that Persian Jews were also writing something called rubaiyat, which is one of the main forms of poetry in Persia. These are quatrains. Omar Khayyam, the famous poet, he wrote rubaiyat. So it's very cool to be able to see these rubaiyat, which are just like those Khayyam poems, but instead of being written in Perso-Arabic script, they're written in Hebrew letters. So you read, it's crazy to find this manuscript and it's in Hebrew letters, but when you read it, it's in Persian. It's very cool. And it really shows how the Persian Jews were deeply a part of Persian literary culture. Now, the question that arises from that is, were the Jews also a part of Jewish literary culture, right? We know that they were part of Persian culture. We can see that. Were they, did they have similarities with Jews from the West, Jews from Europe, Jews from North Africa? So first of all, the answer is yes. The Persian Jews also wrote poems in Hebrew. They have a lot of references to Hebrew writings in their poems. One that really comes up that you may have thought of, right? If we're talking about rose imagery, what's a book of the Tanakh that is full of lover imagery, rose imagery, the idea that the beloved is the relationship between two lovers is the same as the relationship between man and God. The answer is Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs. It has a lot of really deep, the idea of like Moed E Gol, right? This is a line that repeats, come with me into the garden. So this is a very cool thing, is there's actually a poem I found, and this is one of many, but this is one I found last week. And this is an adaptation of a Hebrew piyut that is, it takes a lot from Shir Hashirim. It has a lot of imagery from Shir Hashirim in this Hebrew piyut that wasn't written by Persian Jews, right? It was written by Haim ben Sahel in the 10th century, I think probably in North Africa, because this is a very popular piyut among North Africans. And as you can see on the Hebrew at the top, it says, so it's a time for lovers, come to my garden, etc. So this is a deeply mystical poem also, but also a romantic poem. And it's written in Hebrew. This is a common piyut. It's a Hebrew religious poem, just like Duror Ikra or Adon Olam, things like that. This is in that same vein. And this is what's really cool is there was a Persian writer, someone anonymous, I don't even know his name, but he found this piyut from somewhere in North Africa, likely. And he writes what it says at the top, tafsir et dodin kala. So tafsir means both a translation and an interpretation of this piyut. And if you look at the second paragraph, if you try to read that Hebrew, you may quickly notice that it's not Hebrew. It's in Hebrew letters, but it's in Persian. So I'll read that to you in Persian so you can get a sense of what it sounds like with the rhythm and the rhyme and the meter. And then we'll compare the tafsir, the not exactly translation, but the interpretation from the Hebrew into Persian, and see how kind of more floral imagery has been added and the meaning has changed a little bit. So in Persian, it goes like this. وقت صبحت است بیا به باغم گل کرده نارم بیا تفاقم گذشت زمستان آسوده از غم برخیز محبوبم آفزوده شاخم. So in the Hebrew, it says, it is a time for lovers, come to my garden. In Persian, it says, it is time to confer, come to my garden. So confer, the idea that through speaking, we can bring two people closer together. We can even become one through conferring. It's like the word for conversation, and it's a word that's often used for conversation between man and God. So time to confer, come to my garden. The vine has flowered into pomegranates. In Persian, that's my pomegranate has flowered, come my excellent one. But there's a very cool piece of wordplay here. The word for my pomegranate is anaram, but he purposely leaves out that initial aleph, not just to make the rhythm, the meter work, but because anaram is pomegranate, my pomegranate, but naram is bringing in the Arabic word for fire. And so he's saying my fire has flowered. It's both saying like the fire, like light my fire, but the fire has flowered and my pomegranate has flowered. If you look at these pictures on the left, two of them are pomegranates and they do look like fire. The autumn rain has passed, becomes winter has passed, great. Arise, my companion, the desire of man, let's go to the field, sleep in the wilderness. That becomes, we are relieved from sorrow. Arise, my beloved, the appendage to my branch. So the appendage to my branch is another very cool one. It's kind of this brings that floral imagery, right? The word for branch, it also means stem. So it's like the appendage to my stem, another stem growing out of this stem. The idea that it is actually like a Buddhist thing too in Siddhartha, if you've ever read that if you kind of hold up a flower you can say this is a flower, but if you hold up the whole plant, you can also say that this is one thing. So one thing can be many things. And it's the same idea that that's that mystical union with God, that I am me, but I am also not me. I am part of the greater universe. Two lovers are separate, but they're also one. So there's this deep meaning to calling your beloved the appendage to my branch. You're another branch growing out of the same flower. We're different flowers, but we're one flower. So very beautiful, beautiful poetry. And I think it's so wild that there's this beautiful poetry and it's from an anonymous author. We don't even know who did this translation, but just randomly pops up in a manuscript, and very, very cool. So next we're going to look at one more example. This is actually one of my favorites. So we're going to look at some deeply mystical, very explicitly Sufi Persian and Jewish poetry. This is written by Simantov Melamed of Yazd and Mashhad. I saw in the chat somebody said they hung out with Mashhadi Jews once. This was a rabbi from the city of Yazd, and then he moved to Mashhad. He lived in the 1700s and early 1800s. And he was actually a rabbi. He was a very, very religious, very famous rabbi of this time. And his masterpiece is called Hayat Oruh, which means life of the soul. And it's a very, very interesting book. I haven't finished all of it. It's quite long. But he basically takes Maimonides' 13 attributes of God, which is a kind of rational argument for what God must be. And he takes it and he makes it very, very mystical. He has influence from Bahia ibn Pakuda, which is a very mystical poet from Spain about 1,000 years ago. And he takes these two texts and he weaves them together into Persian epic verse, poetic verse. And he basically makes it this very deep tract about the soul trying to lose its ego and become one with God, and what the infinite is, and how can we even understand the infinite, and how can we kind of confer and interact with the infinite? What does a direct experience of God even mean? So he looks at all of that, and it's very deep, cool stuff. So I'll read part of that last paragraph for you so you can see what it sounds like, and then we'll look at the translation also. So he says, Hezaron zahmet az kharesh sarayad, az in shakhe be an shakhe rad ayad, ser sham ta sahar darad taqalla, ze nutq anbarin khanad tawalla, nayayad bar khiyalash khordan khab, jigar suzan ve ashk rizan و بیتاب. That's a typo. حقیر که این قدر صبر تحمل به کار آرد برای نکهت گل. So you see that word gol, okay? Gol. So we know there's going to be some flower imagery in this, some rose imagery. So what does this mean? Let's look at a translation, and I put it up against the backdrop of the city of Yazd so you can see what kind of place Simantov Melamed came from. So it starts with him talking about kind of bringing another image into it. He's talking about the candle and the butterfly. Consider the candle and the butterfly, which constantly flutter with their passion. So he's using fluttering, the fluttering of a candle or of a butterfly, as a metaphor for passion. And 2 lines from the bottom of that first paragraph, he says, learn the secrets of love from the butterfly, burn around the fluttering flame. Come and look for this fluttering nightingale. From the burning of its heart, it is drunk for the rose. So brings in the rose again. What does a rose have to do with butterflies and flames? So it's saying that the way that you see a butterfly fluttering its wings, the way you see a flame fluttering, that all represents passion. And the nightingale, just like those, is fluttering its wings because remember, it's the one that yearns for something. And it's yearning from the burning of its heart. It's drunk for the rose. It's drunk for perfection, for beauty, for mystical union with God. So we're going to get deeper into that in the next paragraph. And this next paragraph, I think, is also really cool because it mentions, basically has imagery of staying up all night. And I think this is probably a coincidence, but something that we do during Shavuot, a lot of people do, is stay up all night studying Torah. So this might be a reference to that. He says, the two eyes do not meet until dawn, right? Staying up all night. Wail in song, burning from the love of a rosebud. 1,000 toils come from its thorns. the thorns of that rose, right? The cruelty of the thing you're longing for but can't attain. 1,000 toils come from its thorns. They grow from this branch and that branch. From night until dawn they struggle. From the stinging discourse it sings with agitations. Going to sleep does not occur to them. Their livers burning, tears falling, longing. Livers burning is like hearts burning in English. And you can see there is some, it feels like it's talking about two lovers kind of having an argument all night. The humble one who withstands such yearning to be rejected by the rose, its purpose is to visit for one moment to open the rosebud's colorful face. So this becomes that godly imagery. The humble one who withstands such yearning to be rejected by the rose, the mystic who sits there all night, trying and trying and trying to lose his ego, lose this selfishness and become one with God. And again, it's rejected. And again, it keeps trying because its only purpose is even just to attain for one moment this mystical union with God, to open the rosebud's colorful face, right? To reach that thing that it's longing for. And then the last line, it says, give justice, O author and judge being names for God. Give justice, O author and judge, melt our souls together from dawn to night. It's both romantic and mystical. Two people with their souls melted together from dawn to night, and the human, the soul, and God melting together. I think that's so cool that it's saying to melt our souls, taking one soul that's a solid, separate object and turning it into liquid, melting together with the soul of the universe and of God. Very deeply mystical. This is a very cool poem. I wish it was translated into English. I did this translation. I wish the whole thing was translated. Hopefully one day it will be, so that more people can enjoy the depth of this poetry. We're going to look at one or two other examples. You may be wondering, what does this kind of poetry sound like? So we're going to look at an example that somebody actually sings. Most of these were probably poems that were sung and not just read aloud. So we'll see what it sounds like when sang. And this poem is actually in a non-Persian Jewish language. This is in Judeo-Esfahani. The Jews of Iran spoke many languages. In the Northwest region, they spoke Aramaic. In the central area, they spoke a lot of Jewish languages that are somewhat related to Persian, but they're also quite different. So you'll notice, well, if you speak Farsi, you'll notice that this language probably doesn't really make sense to you. It's a little bit different. But luckily, the word for flower is the same. So if you hear the word gol, you'll know that it's talking about a flower. And this is in Judeo-Esfahani. It's actually a wedding song, and the reason it uses gol, it's comparing the bride's face to a flower. So the perfection of the beloved again, but it's kind of a sad wedding song. It's about not wanting to get married, but it's cool. It's an example of something written by a woman, presumably, and we'll get the chance to hear what it sounds like a little bit.
گلورو چازور به سر که گل هوای شوزنه مونم گوه که زبوام ویتره که زبوام نونو کره که زمره جنگ و دوا مونم گوه که زبوام ویتره گل رو چازور به سر که گل هوای شوزنه مونم گوه که زبوام ویتره که زبوام نونو کره که زمره دعوا و جنگ.
Okay, so that is just kind of an example of what it sounds like. We're going to look at one more example because there was a special request to look at an example from a Jewish Neo-Aramaic language, which are languages spoken in the western part of Iran, in Iranian Kurdistan. So this is a more contemporary poem. This is written by Danny Avrahami. And he is talking about his language that's kind of disappearing now that they've left their other homeland in Iranian Kurdistan. And so this is a Semitic language. It's not really related to Persian at all. It's more related to Hebrew. It's very close to Hebrew and Arabic, but it has so much influence from Kurdish and Persian because it's been in this region for so long that it has a lot of words that if you're a Persian speaker and you heard somebody speaking this language, you'd pick up a lot of the words too. So we'll do just verses 49 and 50. In Hulala, it is Kumna tarocha lacha hamyalach mangol enutle kapaman daryalach Kumna tashimsha mashchnalach o einahu valde merkalach o. And it means, I shall tell the wind to bring you my language here and put you like sweets in our mouths. I shall tell the sun to warm you and make you grow like flowers. The flowers is the imagery that is being used to describe something, this language that is dying out. In the next couple generations, it'll be gone. But what he's saying is, it's tying it to classical Persian poetry and saying that, the preservation of this language for him is that thing that he yearns for. The nostalgia of his childhood is what he yearns for. He wants to go back to that. He wants to preserve this culture and language for the future. Allow me to get very nerdy for a second. In verse 50, you'll see that the word for flowers is warde, or the singular is varda. Varda is the Aramaic word for pink, the color pink, or for rose. If you speak Hebrew, that's vered in Hebrew. And if we can get really, really nerdy, this is from an etymological dictionary. It says the word gol, rose, flower in Persian, is from the late Middle Persian gol, which comes from Old Persian verda. So you see verda, vered. So the Old Persian and the Old Aramaic word are the same. And I don't really know what the phonetic changes are that get verda to become gol, but somebody has traced that. And verda also became, in ancient Greek, rodon, which became rose. So I just think it's great that the words that we're using for this object of the rose are from the same source, whether it be Aramaic, Hebrew, Persian, Old Persian, English, any of these languages, they all come from the same word. So the rose, this thing that we've been talking about, this object of our yearning for a long time gone, whether you're yearning for a long time gone or a physical and literal lover or beauty and pleasure or obliteration within God, the great one, Gadol, or safety and wealth and health and redemption by a Redeemer, by Goel. I hope that you have a Moed E Gol Mubarak. Here are some pictures of flowers that I took for your pleasure. And I hope that however you spend Shavuot, whether you're staying up all night studying or looking at flowers or reading the book of Ruth and reading about Goel, the Redeemer, however you spend it, I hope you have a very happy Moed E Gol. So hopefully that's a nice introduction to the place of flowers in Persian Jewish poetry and just Persian Jewish poetry in general. It's a vast, vast subject. Hopefully there will be a lot more scholarship about it in the coming years. So I guess we can open it to questions. And I don't know if there's a moderator for that or if I should just look.
Yes, I do have some questions here that I can read out to you. Let me scroll back a little bit and pick out the ones that were most popular. First of all, everyone would love for you to share the presentation as after the event so they can look over the beautiful poetry.
Sure.
So I think some of these have been answered, so I'm going to kind of skip over the ones that I feel have been answered. Here's a question. What is the meaning of the Judas tree?
I actually don't know. That's a good question. I did see that come up a few times, so I'll have to I'll have to look at that. I guess it's some kind of tree, but I'm sure there's a deeper kind of mystical meaning to it.
All right. We also have, and I think you mentioned this during the presentation, but people may have missed it. Did you translate these, or is there a scholarly source with an English translation?
Yeah, I translated most of those. There are a few that are done by Vera Maureen. So I'll also, I guess when we send the PDF, I can send the name of the book.
How do you spell her name?
VeraMoureen. I'll put it in the chat.
No, I got it.
So yeah, so she's done a good amount, but it's still like a drop in the ocean. Most of it is just things that I like while scanning through manuscripts. I'm like, whoa, this is a very interesting poem. I got to write down what it means, and I kind of translate it. And I'm also like, somebody else could surely translate better than me. I'm just a first-generation American who speaks this language, but yeah, there are very, very, very few.
And I just want to say that you've gotten some really great feedback on those translations. People are really enjoying and think they're beautiful. Okay, here's an interesting question. So in the Christian New Testament, is any of the imagery in the poetry you're talking about related to the idea of Jesus as the Rose of Sharon? I do think this is just as a heads up to the asker, I think this is a bit outside the scope of my Jewish learning because we don't really do anything like Christian theologically, but if you know as a professor.
I don't know. I mean, there it's a possibility that there was some, interaction with Christian Armenians and Assyrians in the region. But I think more likely the image of the rose in the New Testament is probably coming from a similar source of just a Middle Eastern, love of the rose and use of the rose as this important metaphor in poetry. I would imagine it's kind of a similar source thing, and not that the Persian Jews were getting it from the New Testament.
How can we best follow your work and scholarship?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not like an official academic. I have a couple papers I'm working on now, but they haven't come out yet. So yeah, don't know.
And I guess if this looks like probably the last one, are roses cultivated in Iran/Persia?
Yes, they are. They have been for, I don't know if they originally were. I don't know if they are native to Persia, but I imagine probably. They're heavily cultivated there. They're made into rose water, which again flavors all the food, and yeah, it's a big part of the culture.
I'm going to pause just for a minute and, okay, here's another question. Does Jewish Sufi poetry similarly use the language of the birds that's used in Islamic Sufi poetry, like different birds used as archetypes for types of people?
Yeah, great question. It most certainly does. I mean, a lot of Sufi, like non-Jewish Sufi poetry is even like translated into Judeo-Persian. So you'll look at a manuscript and there'll be a bunch of like songs in Hebrew and Persian Jewish writings and all of these different things that you see in Persian Jewish manuscripts. And there'll also be Rumi written in Hebrew letters and, Hafez written in Hebrew letters, very common. So I'd have to look through and kind of see where that language of the birds, if it pops up, but surely it is. And I think I've even seen Conference of the Birds in Hebrew letters.
So I want to thank you for your amazing and thoughtful responses to these questions. There are a lot of people asking about your background, education, and work. If you have a point of contact for people to email you to ask you about your work, that might
sure.
be good
I'll put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me any other questions or thoughts or anything. I love corresponding with people. So yeah, you can email me there. I have social media you can find, I guess, but yeah, in the chat somebody, so exactly, Sheikh Attar, Conference of the Birds, the forget what the name is in Persian, but yeah, the one about all the birds flying around and realizing that they're all one and that they're, it's like a big metaphor for the unity of God that exists in Hebrew letters somewhere, to see more exactly. Yeah. There are references to the Simor throughout Jewish Persian poetry as well.
I think we are definitely closing our time, but I just want to say, Alan, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. I'm excited to put it up later. And if you had missed Alan's email, I will be able to forward questions you have through our community at My Jewish Learning inbox. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful Shavuot. And thank you, Alan, for joining us and all the research and translating you did.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.